Coming up next on Another View, the abolitionist movement. This year is the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and historians and documentarians are taking another look at slavery and this country's fight with itself on the institution. WHRO is airing The Abolitionist, a 3-part American experience documentary featuring 5 well-known abolitionists: Douglass, Stowe, Brown, Garrison, and Grimke. In this hour, we talk with historian Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander about why so many were willing to tear this country apart to build it back together again. It's an Another View history lesson right after this news from NPR.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Happy New Year. This is our first live broadcast in 2013, so we're really happy to be with you this afternoon, and we want to wish everyone prosperity and happiness in 2013. We also want to send a shout out to our producer, Lisa Godley. She had some surgery this week. She's recuperating well, and we miss you, Lisa. And we hope that you come back real soon. So it was the original civil rights movement, brave men and women, black and white, who literally risked their lives to end slavery. I'm talking about the abolitionist movement. Since this is the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation this year, there is renewed interest in slavery and the effect of the institution on blacks and on this country. Now, WHRO is airing a PBS 3-part documentary called The Abolitionist. Part 2 airs this coming Tuesday, January 15th at 9. That's on WHRO-TV. And since Hampton Roads has had so much history in terms of slavery, we've invited our favorite historian, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, to join us to talk about the abolitionist movement. Hi, Cassandra.
Hi, Barbara.
Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you and all the listeners.
Absolutely. Before we get started, let's play a clip from the abolitionist, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Only a few can now tell of the peril that brooded over the land when the anti-slavery movement was born.
Mother, it is my duty to bear testimony
Angelina, mind your own business.
It is my business, and it's your business too.
My mother was named Harriet Bailey. I can't recollect of ever seeing her by the light of day.
I am tormented by the thought of the slave mothers whose babes are torn from them.
I am willing to be persecuted, imprisoned, and bound for advocating African rights.
Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin.
I stand before you as a southerner, exiled from the land of my birth by the sound of the lash and the piteous cry of the slave.
My dear Mr. Douglass, join me.
What is the mob? What if that mob should burst in upon us and commit violence on our persons? Would this be anything compared with what the slaves endure?
How many slaveholders have you converted? How many slaves have you freed?
Slaveholders have forfeited even the right to live. And if the slaves should put every one of them to the sword tomorrow, who would say that they deserve anything less than death? It is not light that is needed, but fire.
The Constitution of the United States of America is an agreement with hell. So perish all compromises with tyranny.
What are you talking about?
The war!
If we fail, we shall go down as we deserve to go down. But if we succeed, our glory as a nation will be complete. Our peace will flow like a river, and our foundations will be the everlasting rocks.
and that was a preview of The Abolitionists, which is airing on WHRO-TV 15. Part 1 was this past Tuesday. Part 2 is this coming Tuesday, January 15th. Now, Cassandra, I know you watched it because you and I talked just before the program came on. I'm curious, from a historian's perspective, what you thought of the documentary.
Well, after watching part 1, I was really impressed by the use of the dramatization, the recreation of certain scenarios. I thought that they did a very effective job. I was struck by the intensity of the emotions that those presentations generated. At the same time, I was disappointed that the broader story was not at least mentioned. I understand that often filmmakers make choices, that if they want to tell a certain story, they'll select a few people to tell those stories. But the people they selected were a bit on the traditional side. And what I mean by that is that the abolitionist fight, while most people see abolitionists as white people, abolitionism was very much a part of the African American community or communities. And I put an S on that because we're talking about not just a single community, but throughout the country, north and south, in small towns and villages and larger cities. It was everywhere. It was people who were free, people who were enslaved. And the only representative was perhaps the most well-known African American abolitionist, and that was Frederick Douglass. But he certainly came into the whole argument about 60 years after other black abolitionists were very much a part of the effort to end slavery.
In watching it then, if especially for the younger generation, if you never had an opportunity to study the rest of the story, you would get a certain perception that that these people were the leaders of this movement, and from where this story starts, that's the full story, and that's not the case.
No, it's simply that from the perspective of the English abolitionists, who were perhaps the most noted ones, even though no one really talks about the English abolitionists today, but their societies really helped to fuel financially a lot of the abolitionist societies in this country. These individuals that they picked out were well known to a lot of the English abolitionists, but they were not that a lot of the black abolitionists were not as well known to the English abolitionists, and that's perhaps why you did not have any focus on them. These individuals that were highlighted were really internationally known individuals. And so I'm going to step out on a limb and make an assumption, which you know you're not supposed to do, but I'm going to make an assumption that the filmmakers really wanted to focus on people that were known internationally as taking a stand against slavery. And they included kind of the traditional icons of black, whites, and then women. And by women, white women. But there were some very prominent black women who were very much involved in abolitionism very early on. And by very early on, I'm talking about the 1780s and 90s. Wow. In fact, right about the time period that the Second Constitution was being written, that's when you started to see petitions with thousands of signatures, 30,000, 400,000 signatures going to the state legislatures and eventually to Congress asking for relief from slavery. And yet slavery was a very important part of both of our constitutions from the beginning, the Articles of Confederation and the 1789 Constitution that still governs us today. And many people don't realize that slavery was an institution that both of those constitutions said the federal government would protect. And it's actually
because it was economic.
It was not just economic. It was political. It was social. This institution was not only an institution that created considerable wealth for many people. But it was an institution that guided the way that people lived their lives and the places that they lived in society.
So the idea of eliminating slavery literally would change the way that this country functioned.
Yes, and that's why this country went, I would say, the safe route, and that is institutionalized Jim Crow or segregation throughout the world, throughout the nation. And it wasn't just a Southern institution. It wasn't a Southern set of laws. It actually was a set of laws that started from the North. And these northern segregation laws that were created beginning in the 1830s, at the beginning of the height of abolitionism in this country, that those laws then would become national laws after Reconstruction ended.
Let's take it back just a little bit to talk about the reason for abolitionism to begin with. I mean, what was the movement about?
Somewhere around the time of the Enlightenment and the early years of the Great Awakening, as it came to this country in the 1750s, people began to raise questions about the efficacy and the ethics of slavery. And by people, I mean white people. Black people who had been enslaved were fighting slavery all along and saying this was wrong. You should not treat me as an individual this way, or my family this way. But whites began to question the value, the ethics, and the efficacy of slavery. And the reason I'm using efficacy is because it created restrictions, not just for blacks, but for whites as well. It both economic and social and political restrictions. You had to, if you were in the society, you had to be in support of slavery. Otherwise, you were challenging certain kinds of things. And if you weren't in support of slavery, it's the same argument that opponents of Thomas Jefferson's idea of eliminating slavery in this country, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, at least the main part of that, and then later began to continue to push for people to end slavery, is if you are not a slaveholder, you're then having to compete against those who are. And so the economic competition is a problem. And then, so his solution was, well, let's push blacks out of the country. Let's colonize them back.
Let's send them back to Liberia.
Right. Or to Africa in general, or to the islands where blacks had begun to really become the primary population in the West Indies and throughout the Caribbean. That was his solution. Of course, the problem was that by the time America was talking about that, many of the people who were of African descent were not just of African descent. They were mixed. They had all kinds of European ancestry. Some of them came to this country with actually European ancestry, because remember now, there had been trade going on between West Africa and Europe for at least 50 years, 60 years before the Americas was even discovered, quote
I guess
unquote,
I should say, yes.
as a place to go by the Europeans. And so there have been intermixtures going on. There have been intermixtures between blacks and Indians. And so to return them to a country that was now foreign, or a continent that was now foreign, them not even knowing what ethnicity they were a part of. Now, there were some who did, but typically those individuals were in isolated areas, or as in the case of the Dismal Swamp, many of them who escaped to the Dismal Swamp continued to hold on to a lot of their traditions that they had in coming from Africa, and they were able to, because they intermarried among the small group, they were able to preserve those. But those were exceptions as opposed to the rule. So getting back to your original question about how did this begin, we would see then these flames starting to come up. By the 1750s and 60s, we would see this emerge among a new group called the Methodists. We would see this emerge among the Quakers, who had always had kind of a different perspective of their role in society and the way that people should operate, and even the way
that their role was to make society better.
Yes.
and to treat people well. Right?
Yes. And even though you had Quakers who were slaveholders during this period, the Great Awakening began to change the way that they as a group viewed that role. And so they were the first to adopt an anti-slavery stance as a group. There were still some Quakers who owned slaves. There were still some Quakers who were prejudiced towards anybody who was non-white or even non-Quaker.
And to that point, the abolitionists in general, and this may be a generalization, but because they wanted slaves freed, did not necessarily mean they wanted black people equal to them.
Right, and there's a big difference between social equality and freedom. And so a lot of these early people who began to form these abolitionist societies, they didn't believe in forcing someone to accept. In fact, that was the idea of Quakerism. I'm not forcing you. I'm convincing you that this is a moral wrong. And so they began to use this term moral suasion. I'm persuading you morally to pull away from slavery. It's not good for your soul. It's not good to treat someone in this manner, and using religious ideology of how would you want to be treated? Not just slaves be good to your master, but do you want to be a slave? Because unless you want to be a slave yourself, you shouldn't own a slave. So those were a lot of their arguments. But then you had the other side, and that is that some of them who were influenced by the Enlightenment, who believed that this was not politically good, or it was not economically sound to have a forced system of labor, because at any point in time, the slightest thing could send shockwaves through, and you would have a massive slave revolt. And so,
that would cause a whole nother set of problems.
Right, and so. And so there were all of these different waves coming together, but with the American Revolution and its aftermath, where we would see then the Great Awakening expand even more, and we would see these ideas of liberty and freedom, with some people in large numbers getting their freedom who had served in the war. You would begin to see different dynamics emerge, and you would see a black population and community form. You would see black churches emerging. And by black churches, I mean that the congregations were mostly black, if not all black. And they found common ground, and they found additional voices. And they began to petition their state legislatures and eventually Congress to end slavery, because they saw their rights infringed upon by the existence of slavery, because there was this idea that if you were black, you were a slave. And so then the onus was on you to prove your freedom. And they felt that was a burden that was unfair as a citizen of this country. Because the idea of blacks not being citizens, especially if you were free, was, even though you had some people who questioned that wasn't really a question that would emerge until you began to get into the 19th century, and especially as abolitionism really began to kick it up a notch and become radical and even militant. That's when questions were raised about whether or not blacks were citizens. And then the Supreme Court decision of 1857, the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court would rule that no black person, free or enslaved, was a citizen.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. David joins us from Chesapeake. Hi, David. You're on the air.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I have to first say, I know you've done, other topics similar to this, but I believe this historian, the person you have now, she's so thorough. It's really nice to hear her perspective on the entire thing. And I've watched the first part of the series, and I think also, not only the impact from the international part of it, from how they've kind of displayed in the documentary, but it also, I think there's been so much complication with the slavery part of U.S. history that where, it's almost kind of like, well, all whites were wanted slavery and were against blacks and all that kind of thing, when that really wasn't the case. But it's kind of been portrayed like that, and I think people's minds get twisted a little bit on it. But I do agree with a lot of what she says, but there's also some more complicated parts to it where, let's say for Thomas Jefferson, for instance, he had, relations with his one of his slaves. And I think based on, I've done a lot of research on this. I'm not a historian, but I think a lot of reasons why he did what he did was to help their, to help his that race or whatever better themselves by having offspring. He knew that later on, maybe by passing on his intelligence and genetics, and mating with her, that it would help her offspring and her family later on down the road by having his genetics and name and whatever to associate with that. And then one of the other things that complicates, I think, the slavery issue is like just take for instance Anthony Johnson here in the Virginia. He went to court to obtain slaves or to keep slaves, and he was a black man, and but yet also owned slaves. And so you have this struggle here where you have people against it, you have people for it, and then you also had black people who also owned, had freed themselves or had European descent as well as African, and so they were like for slavery. But I think one of the biggest critical movements that kind of pushed this over the edge were the children of, say, the slave owners, where their children had developed these really good relationships and started trying to educate the slaves, whether the women or their children or the men, and they developed these really nice relationships. And I think the masters of slave owners started, the plantation owners or what have you, started looking at that, saying, bringing that ethical, that different change of heart to say, these people really aren't that bad, and they're my kids get along with them, what have you, and and I think that's where it really started making that
okay,
strong.
David, let's let Cassandra, you brought up several points, so let's let Cassandra react to that, and we appreciate your call. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the complexities of this time period are numerous. In fact, when you talk about how human beings react to individuals, it's always different than how they react to a group. If I have a personal relationship with you, I see you as an exception as opposed to the rule. In the case of Thomas Jefferson, for example, even though people have talked about and referred to Sally Hemings as Dusky Sal, all the reports say that she looked just like Thomas Jefferson's wife. She was, in fact, her half-sister. And I've never seen an actual portrayal of her looking like his wife. And all the portrayals I've seen show her as being singularly a black woman, a light-skinned black woman, but a black woman nonetheless. And all the historical reports say that she looked white. And so I think that Thomas Jefferson, if he ever said that he wanted to have children with her because of he wanted to impart his DNA and so forth, that was actually the standard pro-slavery excuse of intermingling with blacks and maintaining slavery nonetheless. It's reminiscent to me of any excuse that people give for their behavior that they feel is morally or ethically wrong. But in addressing some of the other points he brought up Anthony Johnson. This was in the 17th century. Anthony Johnson came to this country as an unfree person, and it took about 30 years before he was granted his freedom. He was from Angola. His wife was from Angola. And when he had a servant, some of his white neighbors had actually accused him of certain things, but got this servant to claim that he was holding him longer than his years of servitude. And so he went to court and lost first, and then came back and brought evidence that there was a collusion going on. So whether or not the person was actually going to be his slave, even though years later some historians have depicted that as a slavery situation, is not really clear, because in the 17th century, the institution of slavery did not have the solidification the clarity that it would later have by the 18th and 19th centuries. But what you bring to the forefront is, yes, this situation about abolitionists, about how people interacted with one another in our society is very, very complex. But the way that the abolitionists so far have been portrayed in this film, it kind of leaves out some of the real complexities. For example, I was hoping, and maybe they'll do it in
part two or part three,
right? But in the 1830s. For example, that's when the American Anti-Slavery Society began. They kind of jumped over that, but it began in 1833. It began as both an interracial organization and a intergender organization. All the other previous abolitionist societies, basically, for the white abolitionist societies, they were all white and they were all male. The black abolitionist societies allow both women and men to be a part, and they didn't exclude whites, but they were essentially all black organizations. But by 1833, they combined their forces together, becoming a much more powerful entity. And even though that organization had problems, even from the beginning, and it would break up as an organization by the 1840s over the issue of whether women should have a prominent role in that organization, it happened at a time when the nation was expanding westward, when the abolitionists decided to put more pressure on this country to abolish slavery and not to allow slavery to continue to expand westward. There were some prohibitions put in our 1789 Constitution that would prohibit slavery from expanding eventually to northern areas, like eventually what we call the Great Lakes region today, and then there were laws put in place to enforce that. But for the South, the Southerners were continuing to expand westward, and abolitionists decided no, and they began to petition the state and Congress to stop that. It got so bad that Congress in 1836 passed a gag order to keep even an issue of slavery or abolitionism from coming before Congress. A lot of the
so they
states
actually tried to stop them from using the process
from discussing
to change the laws.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And Andrew Jackson wanted to get Congress to pass a law to keep any abolitionist paraphernalia, newspapers, pamphlets, from going through the mail. He wanted to make that illegal. You had some states, even Norfolk, passed legislation, an ordinance, which I thought was very interesting. It was about in 1841 that forbade the postmaster to deliver abolitionist newspapers to its enslaved population. And so I thought, wait, you mean the enslaved people had
they actually
subscriptions?
Got mail? Yeah, they got subscriptions.
And then they got mail. So it was a very interesting time period. There was so much going on. Of course, the documentary depicted William Lloyd Garrison being attacked by a mob. That was in 1835. Shortly after that, a couple of years later, Elijah Lovegood, who was a white abolitionist, was killed in Ohio. And Ohio was really a battleground. He was killed in Illinois. But Illinois and Ohio, they were battlegrounds for a lot of anti-slavery and pro-slavery sentiment. And so you had all these things going on in the 1830s, and the nation was afraid that it was going to be torn apart in that time period. And interestingly, that was also the time period that these ideas of we're one nation under God, that our origins were coming not from Jamestown, but from Plymouth, because it was the Pilgrims going to Plymouth that said we're dedicating this land to God. That didn't happen in Jamestown. And so there was an actual effort by leaders to create an image that wasn't real of who America was or what it was, of what it wanted to be, of who we were as Americans, that was diametrically different than all the rancor going on internally.
If you're just joining us, this is Another View history lesson on the abolitionist movement with Norfolk State University historian Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call. Carl joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Carl.
Hi, how are you, Cass? I'm sorry. Did I call you Cassie? I apologize.
That's okay. This is Barbara, though. Go ahead. What's your question?
Okay. It's not so much a question as a comment. One of your readers a few seconds ago called back and talked about Thomas Jefferson passing on intelligence. I resent that. I resent it for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's a book out called Muslims in Africa and America, and it talks about slaves who came here who had memorized, for example, the Quran. And the Quran is 114 chapters, 6,666 words, and there are only almost now a million people, or 20 million people who have memorized it. They were scientists, they were architects, they were kings and queens, Sheba being one of them. There wasn't an intelligence. Thomas Jefferson may have been sexually attracted to her, and many slave masters bought their wives. They became second wives or what have you. And, of course, Thomas Jefferson's mistress, a purported mistress, was the sister of his wife.
Yeah, that's what Dr. Alexander just explained to us. Thanks, Carl, for the call. I hear what you're saying, and I think that the gentleman who called in, that was one perspective that he had, and unfortunately, a lot of people had that perspective, including, unfortunately, the abolitionists. In terms of, here is a human being who should not be enslaved, but that does not necessarily mean that they also should have the same rights that I have. I have a question for you, though, Cassandra. When you look at Nat Turner and his uprising, and then you look at Frederick Douglass and his more pacifism in terms of how to approach the whole idea of abolitionism, and then you look at the Black Panthers and you look at Martin Luther King. I mean, each generation, it seems like there's this separation of, should we do it the radical way or should we do it the peaceful way?
Well, it's interesting that you categorize Frederick Douglass as a pacifist. I think he would probably object to that.
Well, I think, and I didn't see him going out. Well, he did beat the master and and so forth, but I didn't see him in the same vein of someone who wanted to have the slaves revolt and kill their masters. Not like a Nat Turner. Am I wrong in that?
Well, I think that it's a difference in where you are and what power you have, what voice you have, and he used his words as swords, and just as David Walker, who wrote Walker's Appeal, and it was published in 1829, that called upon blacks to rise up and to take their freedom, and if someone tried to stop them, to take it by force. And many people accused him of advocating a slave revolt. And essentially his position was, only if you make it a revolt, only if you try to stop me will it be a revolt. And so I think it's really just perspective. Here you had Nat Turner, who, like many enslaved people, was in a different situation, and he believed that from his actions, he believed that the only way to gain his freedom was to kill everybody who could potentially stop him. But Frederick Douglass said some very incendiary things, and by incendiary, he was kind of whipping people up to be as he did, and that is to take a stand. And if that meant that I'm going to fight to the death, then fight to the death. Take a stand enough to face your opponent head on, and to be resolved to die in that effort to achieve your freedom. That was the point that he reached. Yeah, and
more so because I understand what you're saying about using the words to still to in some ways that's even more dangerous than Nat Turner, the Nat Turners of the world who did it by physical violence.
Not only that, but he put his words into print. And it's one thing to say something in a forum, then everyone interprets what you say. But then when you put it in print, then it becomes even a more powerful force, and it can be disseminated exactly the way you want it to be disseminated.
When you talk about Walker, then why did the Liberator then get so much more play, if you will, in terms of the literature that was being sent out on abolitionism compared to like David Walker?
Well, David Walker wrote a book. It was a pamphlet,
Okay.
and then he died the year after. But the Liberator went on for decades. It was a very important and strident voice, and he didn't just advocate against slavery. He also published information about runaways. He talked to, he even published or reprinted letters with fugitives who would be in Canada, who were essentially taunting their owners, saying, "Yeah, I'm up here, and you're not here." And so there was nothing you can do, and he allowed a voice for a lot of different abolitionists, both black and white, male and female. And so his voice had longevity that none of the other black newspapers had. Even the Provincial Freeman, that was a very important newspaper published in Canada. In fact, it was started by Samuel Ward, but Mary Ann Shadd Carey is a long name, but Mary Carey is the shortened version. She was the first black woman to actually publish a newspaper. She took over publication shortly after, but that only lasted between 1854 and 1857. And they were publishing news about people who had run away and were now living in the Ontario province of Canada. Most of the people from this area who ran away after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed ended up in the Ontario province.
I want to talk about Hampton Roads specifically, but let's take a call from Amy in Norfolk. Hi, Amy, you're on the air.
Hi there.
Hi.
You might have answered my question when I was asking my question to your call taker, but anyway, in regard to Nat Turner, did the news spread up to the Eastern Shore quickly, or did it take a long time? And would people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman have known right away about what happened in Southampton County? Or did it take a while? How widespread was the information, and how quick was it disseminated?
That the uprising had happened. Is that what you're talking about? Okay. Thanks, Amy.
Perhaps you might be thinking of the John Brown raid instead of the Nat Turner revolt, because the Nat Turner revolt happened in 1831, and both Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were both still enslaved at that time. I think they were children or young.
They have heard about it. Would the news have
probably
was there some kind of underground
not
communication link?
Probably not. Although the Nat Turner revolt did get international attention, but it was mostly because of the book that was published and the newspaper articles that came out following that. But Douglass and Harriet Tubman did know about the plans in 1859 by John Brown.
Right, at Harper's Ferry.
Right, to attack Harper's Ferry and to start a revolt. And
but they had distanced themselves from him.
Not
Did they
really.
not? No?
Not really. That came out later that they had. But no, Frederick Douglass opted not to join with that, but he didn't bear him ill will. He just thought that it was rather ill-conceived. And as it turned out, it was. It was not a well-planned out revolt that John Brown planned. And, of course, Harriet Tubman felt pretty much the same way. And so they didn't participate. And that was true of most of the abolitionists. They didn't participate in that.
So what is the role of the contraband or is there a role of the whole contraband situation in terms of abolitionism? Or was that already, because that happened during the Civil War itself? And am I correct in saying that most of the abolitionist activities were prior to?
Well, there was abolitionism going on during the war. In fact, the American Missionary Association was started by Arthur and Lewis Tappan. And the Tappans were very involved with William Lloyd Garrison in helping to start the American Anti-Slavery Society, but they were very passionate against women's rights. But they were the ones who started that organization, and that organization helped with the Amistad situation. They were trying to get the Africans on the Amistad returned. And the American Missionary Association was the most prominent. It was the first and the most prominent organization to come to the South. It was Lewis Lockwood who was sent by the AMA, the American Missionary Association, to come to the South, to Fort Monroe, to help with the people who were designated as contrabands. And he came down in September of 1861. And so the AMA was an abolitionist organization, but they were more in the religious perspective of trying to assist people in with basic necessities, food, water, shelter, clothing, but also education, because they knew how important education was to someone doing for themselves and not just surviving, but doing well in society. And so they put a lot of resources into that. And they put a lot of effort into helping to proselytize people, to convert them to Christianity, because there is this perception that most blacks were Christians.
We're Christians. Okay.
When most no, it was the perception. I mean, we think of the Negro slave spirituals or the Negro spirituals, that kind of thing, and actually Lockwood collected a lot of those songs and published them as the Negro spirituals, and it's from that you got the Hampton singers and who popularized Negro spirituals. But there is the perception that these people were all Christians when, depending on, if you were on a plantation and you were isolated, the owners didn't want you to become a Christian. There was nothing in it for them. And
if
they
you
actually
became
thought,
a Christian too, that might have led to you being able to read or to be taught to read.
Well, that's sort of the irony of slavery anyway, because here in the city of Norfolk, there were prominent churches who taught all their members, those who were enslaved as well as free, how to read and write. And so that was because they wanted them to learn how to read the Bible. So that was a problem because it was in direct violation of the law. But the question of the contrabands, the designation of contraband was a way that the government was using to, the Union government, to not have to legally return people that they knew were being used by the Confederacy to help fight against the Union government. And then it was extended to those who were with these men who were designated as contraband. So then they were including all blacks, with the realization that the women were also being used to help prepare the food and, raise the food in some cases, or pick the cotton or the tobacco or whatever was being produced. And this would, of course, help the Southerners fund their war effort. And so they wanted to deprive the Confederacy of all of that. But the fact that they became contrabands, it fits into this whole abolitionist thing, because by the 1830s, there was a concerted effort by abolitionists, primarily stimulated by black abolitionists, to help people to actually escape. And so this is even though you would see the birth of the Underground Railroad by the 1830s, by the 1850s, it became even more of an effort. There was more of a desire and a passion to use the Underground Railroad to help undermine slavery by pulling people away from the South and depriving the South of their labor. And so in that way, the whole contraband issue and the fugitives were similar. It was a way of depriving the South and of the nation in general of the use of slaves for their labor.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Daniel joins us from Hampton. Hi, Daniel.
Oh, hey. This conversation gets me thinking about the present day and how some of these situations may be institutionalized, where devalued people may still be in slavery through the drug war and the prison system. because human nature doesn't seem to change all that much. And just wondering, I've been researching a lot on the internet and listening to a lot of Noam Chomsky videos. You know Noam Chomsky?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that guy. Really interesting, and other people have been talking about the institutionalization of it. And when I hear these stories, I think, wow, did all these attitudes disappear? I mean, what do I do with this information? Because in one sense, it makes me feel a little angry. I know you shouldn't feel that way, of course. It should just be something interesting. But I do feel a little anger at the way people can be. And I just wonder, do you feel that or believe? Go ahead.
First of all, in terms of evoking emotion, that's one of the goals of us talking, because whatever your emotion is, it at least allows you the opportunity to think about what this topic means. So we appreciate that. I'm going to let Cassandra react to your statement. Thanks for calling, Daniel.
Well, that's, I think, the decision that the filmmakers of the abolitionist series were trying to do by reenacting these things, not just having historians with the talking heads reciting a story, but rather they're going to dramatize it and let you see it for yourself. This is what Harriet Beecher Stowe did with Uncle Tom's Cabin. You had all of these abolitionists who were writing poems, who were writing polemics against slavery. But when you read a story, you become attached to the characters of that story, or you see a play, or you see a reenactment, and they become real. They're not just one-dimensional objects, but they take on flesh and bone, and you begin to identify the emotions, the passions, and it's that triggers then thought. It triggers first if you get people's attention, and sometimes it's the emotion that gets their attention, then they begin to think. And this is what the abolitionists wanted to do. They wanted to use people like Frederick Douglass, who is incredibly articulate, very intelligent, but he had a real story. It wasn't just what he heard from someone else, but this is what he experienced. But what made him powerful was that he could articulate it in a way that very, very few, if anybody, could articulate these thoughts. And in fact, the reason he wrote the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is because no one believed that this articulate man had ever been a slave.
That he had actually come from slavery.
Exactly.
We only have a few minutes left. I want to touch on Norfolk and Portsmouth and the Underground Railroad and how all that tied in with abolitionism also. I know that's a lot. 4 minutes.
Well, because Hampton Roads was an important port area, and it was important in the products leaving from eastern North Carolina and this part of Virginia going to the rest of the country. And it was also an important place for enslaved people being shipped to the lower South. This then became, in some cases, ground zero for a lot of things. There was another Anthony Johnson who was captured in Boston. He was a runaway slave, and his case became known nationally and even internationally. He passed through Norfolk. You had one of the earliest cases in 1842, George Latimer. He was a slave here in Norfolk, and he and his wife escaped. He was captured in Boston. Even John Quincy Adams got involved in his case. This is after Adams was president. He was back in Congress, and he eventually gained his freedom. Well, these were the parents of Lewis Latimer, the famous inventor and draftsman. You had Shadrach Minkins, who was harbored and helped out of Boston by Lewis Hayden, who was a fugitive slave who was notorious. He had a house on Beacon Hill, and everyone knew he was openly a fugitive, and he refused to allow any slave catchers to capture him. He would answer his door with a shotgun. He threatened to blow up himself, his house, and anybody who entered if they tried to come in. And he was very much involved with a lot of fugitives who left through this area going to Boston. This gave the impression then that there was a national conspiracy at work. And while there was no national conspiracy with key leaders of Congress or state legislatures involved. It was a national network of people who decided that slavery was an affront to this nation, and it had to end. And if it was by force, then that's the way it was going to be. And so this nation really got to that point by the 1850s, where the sides were so polarized and they were so willing to die as well as kill for their cause that's why historians often will say that the Civil War was inevitable.
Cassandra, you have such a wealth of information. I could talk with you all afternoon. I do want to tell our audience, first of all, that if you missed part 1 of The Abolitionists, then you can see it this coming Sunday night at 10 p.m. right after Downton Abbey on WHRO-TV 15. And part 2 is on Tuesday, January the 15th at 9 o'clock. And also on January the 24th from 7 to 8:30, WHRO, in collaboration with Hampton University, is hosting a community discussion on this documentary. We'll be at University's Armstrong Hall Little Theater, and you can call 889-9415 for details. There's a reception from 5:30 to 6:30 at the Hampton University Museum, and then the discussion from 7 to 8:30. It is free and open to the public. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we'll be right back. And welcome back. Time now for things to view and do in Hampton Roads.
You will be my Saturday love.
In celebration of the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Downing Gross Cultural Center in Newport News invites you to the Freedom Concert, a unique offering of song, spoken word, dance, and monologues, along with a one-act play called The Meeting. The event is tonight at 6:30 and the performance is at 8. Call 247-8950 to find out more. The Peninsula chapter of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity holds its Founders Day luncheon on Saturday, January 12th at noon at First Baptist Church, Jefferson Park in Newport News. The luncheon is open to the public and will honor one of the founding members of the chapter, James Holmes. Phi Beta Sigma was founded in 1914 to encourage community service among African American men. For more information, call 358-3505. Kids ages 5 to 14 are encouraged to attend Virginia Healthy Youth Day, Thursday, January 17th, from 3 until 4:30 at the Norfolk Fitness and Wellness Center, Newport News in Norfolk. It's a celebration of healthy living with games, sports, and more. Call 823-4301 for details. And don't miss the latest exhibit at the Hampton History Museum. It's called An American Turning Point, The Civil War in Virginia Part 2, Surviving War, and runs now through April 2013. The museum is located on Old Hampton Lane in Hampton. Call 727-6841 for exhibit hours. These and other events are on our website, anotherviewradio.org, and you can also download podcasts of our shows and sign up for our eView newsletter. It's a once-a-week reminder of upcoming programs. Next week, the first round table of the new year. Roger, Will, Bill, and Carol square off on the issues of the day, so you don't want to miss that. Don't forget that we are doing our screening of The Abolitionists on January 24th from 7 to 8:30. Call 889-9415 for details. That'll be at Hampton University. For producer Morgan Chase, sitting in for Lisa Godley, audio engineer Perry Smith, and Danny Epperson, who answered our phones, I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Have a fabulous weekend, and let's get together again next Friday at noon for Another View.